Now we're moving on to section 1.3, sampling methods. And to help us illustrate what a sampling method does, how it works, I brought up this image here that's arranged in rows, columns. So these are people's faces. It's a stock image, so it's not obviously not a real situation, but this kind of will help us illustrate in real life how these sampling methods work. So first of all, let's review when we talk about sampling, why do we need it? So in general, we want to study the data we want to collect come from a population. And we draw a sample because it's generally too costly or too inconvenient to study an entire population. So, and especially when it comes to people, you need their consent in order to have their participation. So that is another highly important component of any sampling method that deals with individuals. Having said that, once you do have a sample, right, what is a good way to obtain that sample? So we're going to go over a few of those methods, and I'll keep track of which one we're talking about and illustrate using our image here. So the most simple kind of selection that we can do, that is a random method. So a simple random sample of size n. And one really important thing to note here is sample size is a fixed number of people that we're going to, or subjects that we'll need for our sample. And there are some really important effects about sample size that we're going to get into much later on. So first, a simple random sample is when we take our entire population. This stock image represents our population of people, and we choose n of these subjects so that any one group of n of them is as likely as the other. One way to do this would be to maybe assign each one a unique ID number and pick those ID numbers at random from maybe like a lottery ball, or you can do stick drawing. So whoever draws the shortest stick, but you would need, a certain amount of them in order to get your size. So let's say that we're selecting 4 people at random, right? Or maybe we could do something like each row has a letter attached to it. And each column has a letter attached to it, and each row has a number attached to it. And then we, pick out these labels. So this person is F2, this person is C4. Put them all in a random number generator, and we'll get our random 4 people, right? So just for the sake of illustration, let's say it's okay. So we got our 4 people at random. Now I am simulating the randomness here, but in theory, right, those 4 people are just as likely for us to obtain as, for instance, these 4 people, right? So whatever your process is, there's a randomness involved in this. And the math of randomness actually is so important that we're going to talk about it in a later unit. Okay, so that's a simple random sample. And as you may have noticed, it is fairly basic. There's not a whole lot of prep work that you have to do to obtain these samples. Now, if you're not so concerned with randomness, you can obtain a systematic sample. And systematic here means that you have a process, some sort of algorithm, right? So for instance, if I want 4 people again, I could just do down the diagonal. So 1, 2, 3, 4. A1, B2, C3, D4. So there's a pattern here. There's some process that I deliberately picked these 4 people based on. And there's, any number of ways of doing this. You could systematically go, well, I'm going to pick every 5th person. So I'll go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So again, there's a pattern here. I said every 5th person gets selected. Okay. So some drawbacks, right? This isn't random. When you determine your method for picking a sample, you're reducing the amount of randomness in there. And I'm going to get into in a second why we want randomness. Another not random, or not as random, way of obtaining a sample is convenience sampling. Convenience sampling is so called because it's convenient to obtain it. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's lazy, but it just means that things work out easier if you use a convenience sample. So, for instance, let's say this is you, and you pick the 4 people closest to you, or let's say 5. 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? So, what's the problem here? Well, you've picked people who are close to you, and maybe that's because you're friends, or maybe it's arranged by last name. So, there's some inherent randomness that's lost when we do a convenience sample. We could also, pick a whole row or a whole column. So we'll pick these 5 people. And there's still some randomness because maybe the population itself is the way that we arranged everything is random, but it's less than ideal. Okay? And one special subflavor of this is what we call voluntary response sampling. So a voluntary response sample, or a poll or survey, is when you call up from this population, by any means, email, text, call, in person, and you ask them to participate in your study. So you may systematically call every one of these people, and maybe only these people are the ones signing up, right? And that may be fine. That may be a representative sample. There are some organizations that have really robust statistical designs where they can do convenience sampling, polls, and surveys. One really critical example is the Pew Research Center. But they have safeguards so that they are actually covering a large enough swath of the general population that this convenience sample, the people who respond to the survey, are specifically selected to be as representative as possible of the population, right? And then this is an example. So, example. All right. We can do better. We can be more systematic about this if we do something called partitioning. So if we partitioning means to split into groups. So we're disaggregating into our subgroups of the population. Okay, so disaggregating. That's what essentially we're doing when we partition. And we can do this along any number of factors. Popular factors when we're dealing with a population include age, So age bracket, gender expression, more like it, racial identity, right? So to illustrate those, I'm going to add these again. All right. And we have a couple new methods here that we're going to use. And I'll put the labels on again. But the idea is we're going to separate our population into these distinct groups. Everybody should fall into a different group, different category. But let's see, what was I on? I was on 3, so let's go to 4. And the first kind of sampling that we can use when we partition is the stratified sample. What a stratified sample does is, first we partition our population, right? So here I'm going to do something really basic. I'm just going to partition along rows. So row 1, row 2, 3, 4, and 5, okay? When we partition for a stratified sample, we take a simple random sample from each group, okay? So right now, I've stratified into K subgroups, 5 of them, and let's say I want from each one 2 people, right? But they have to be chosen randomly, okay? So from each group, I'm going to choose 2 at random, say these 2. And then each one, right, is an independent random sampling process. Now, obviously, I'm simulating. It's not exactly perfect. But the idea now is, with a stratified sample, is we can pick a more representative sample because of our partition. Now, in real life, we're going to be using more sophisticated stratifying, right? So, for instance, if we wanted to stratify along age, then we could be picking, say, everybody below the age of 30, everyone below the age of 60, and everyone above that, right? I'll illustrate something like that for the next example. So now, let's go into the last one of these, which is the cluster sample. It's called that because when we partition again, we're not going to be randomly selecting people. We're going to be randomly selecting subgroups or clusters, right? So we're going to, let's say we're going to partition along 2 groups, okay? And this is, so keep an eye out for this particular kind of cluster sampling because it'll be really important for experimental design. So let's say we're going to, randomly pick half of these people. So we're going to split down the middle. And at random, we're going to pick one side or the other, right? So flip a coin, for instance. And then let's say it's this one that we end up picking, all right? So that's our cluster that we've selected. And our random sample consists of those people in that cluster, okay? Now, you may be asking yourself, why would we do that instead of stratified sampling? Well, with stratified sampling, you're picking within each cluster, but sometimes we need to pick an entire group of people at random, especially as we go into, and we're going to glance ahead to the next section, but especially as we get into random assignment of groups. In experimental design, we want to randomly assign people to a control or treatment group. I'll get into what those mean later. But this is essentially the process. We're using a cluster sample with k equals 2. One last thing to note, we've been talking about when to use these sampling methods, but there's some principles of sampling that we want to highlight, right? So what is good sampling, right? So we want basically three things. So A, we want samples selected through random selection. Random selection is good. We want random selection. Okay? Random selection helps us obtain representative samples. Think about it in terms of the United States population. When you randomly select US adults, you want to have as broad of a sample representing all sorts of people in the United States. The second principle that we want is we want as large a sample size, which we usually denote with lowercase n, as possible. Okay? Small sample sizes mean that we don't get to study a whole lot. Of course, sometimes it's impossible to get beyond, 100, 1,000 people, and it all depends, on your budget. No, that's not how you spell budget. It depends on your the people that you're working with, right? So your team and time. Maybe you have to submit your project by a certain deadline, and you just can't sample as more people. The last consideration is you want as little non-random sampling error. Let me get into what that means in a second. So, little non-random sampling error. Sampling error is always possible. In any sample that you take, you're always going to have sampling error. When we take a random sample, but there's a difference between the sample result and the true population. So, for instance, and this is actually very common, you'll notice that in this picture, this stock image, we actually have a fairly multiracial group of people here. But what sometimes happens when we select for studies, for instance, facial recognition, sometimes people with white passing faces tend to be the ones selected for studies. For various reasons, but maybe it has nothing to do with, actually selecting for people who identify as white, but the way that photography works, especially when, you have to take a lot of pictures, is sometimes they're calibrated specifically for people with fair skin. So, what does that mean? That means then, if we take this as our sample and we're looking at this population, we're not actually capturing the full depth and breadth of the population we have. So we have sampling error. But what distinguishes between random sampling error and non-random sampling error is that random sampling error is just a fact of nature, but non-random sampling error happens deliberately. It's when we use a sampling method that's not random, first of all, or when it's not appropriate for our study. So those are the kinds of sampling methods that we're going to work with in this course. And obviously we were working with an example here where we were looking at people as subjects, but this does not necessarily need to be individuals. We'll be working with a lot of different populations. And sometimes they're abstract, like organizations.